What if the Church was aware of the undead's existence but concealed it to safeguard your spirit? During the Enlightenment, an era dominated by logic and skepticism toward faith, a priest named Father Anselm stumbled upon accounts that challenged both holy texts and rational thought, bodies that resisted decay, eyes that blinked from beneath the earth, and voices echoing from lips long stilled by death. These weren't mere legends, they were recorded by physicians, soldiers, and priests. As he delved deeper, the truth grew more terrifying, not only about vampires but about what they unveiled regarding divinity, eternal punishment, and humanity itself. Welcome to Tales of Mythology, where ancient tales, hidden terrors, and otherworldly conflicts are brought to life. If you enjoy uncovering the obscure corners of folklore, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on every epic tale. Music. What if even an era of rational thought couldn't hush the murmurs of the undead? Father Anselm, a theological scholar rooted in Enlightenment reason, wrestled with this question under the glow of a flickering lamp. Whispers reached him of corpses that moved, of graves that offered not rest but dread. By all reason, such horrors should have faded in this age of clarity. Didn't Voltaire himself mock, "How can vampires persist in our enlightened 18th century?" Yet these questions haunted Anselm's thoughts. Were these stories mere rural superstitions, or evidence of something horrifyingly real that defied both science and sacred doctrine? A few weeks prior, a report had arrived from the Habsburg frontier. It contained chilling accounts from frightened villagers in a Serbian settlement called Kisilova. As Anselm read the translated document, a shiver ran through him. The report detailed a string of unexplained deaths following the burial of a villager named Peter Plogojowitz. On their deathbeds, victims spoke of a ghastly figure that visited them at night. They claimed that the aforementioned Peter Plogojowitz, deceased for 10 weeks, appeared in their dreams, pinned them down, and choked them. Even Plogojowitz's widow had fled the village, insisting her late husband return to demand his boots. Anselm whispered a prayer, steadying his shaking hand. He reassured himself that tales of ghostly attackers and restless bodies surely had logical explanations. Perhaps a contagion from the grave or collective panic seizing the village. As a man of both faith and intellect, he had dedicated his life to banishing shadows with truth. Now, he felt compelled to probe this grim enigma for the sake of both church and scholarship. Whether demons or illusions were at play, he would uncover the truth. So, Father Anselm set out eastward, leaving Vienna's illuminated libraries for the muddy twilight of rural hamlets. He carried scholarly texts, a worn Bible, and an imperial letter authorizing him to investigate the bizarre case. The farther he ventured from civilized order, the more he felt ancient fears stirring in the countryside. At roadside taverns, locals made the sign of the cross when speaking of the recently departed. In one inn, an elderly man with no teeth shared a tale of a strangely flushed corpse discovered in a nearby graveyard years before, only put to rest by a stake through its chest. Anselm recorded the account with scholarly precision, but unease tightened within him. What am I riding into? He wondered. When he finally arrived in Kisilova under a slate-gray sky, he found the village in mourning and in dread. Doors were marked with crude crosses. The air reeked of garlic strung along thresholds. Villagers eyed the newcomer priest with a mix of hope and terror, as if begging for deliverance from an invisible plague. That evening, Anselm gathered the elders and the local Orthodox priest, Father Georgi, to hear their accounts firsthand. By the glow of tallow candles, voices hushed and quavering, they spoke of 9 sudden deaths in just a week. Each victim had been healthy until, after a single day of fever and fright, they expired, and each, in their final hours, blamed one name, Plogojowitz. Father Georgi confessed that he had joined the imperial official, a certain Mr. Frumbald, in exhuming the accused man's grave. His body, the priest said with a haunted look, was untouched by decay, almost lifelike. Anselm's rational mind wrestled with the impossibility. How could a corpse interred for 10 weeks appear fresh? The physician in him raised the possibility of natural preservation or winter's chill slowing rot. But the villagers had already drawn their conclusion. Plogojowitz was a vampire, one of the dreaded Eupori of Balkan lore. Trying to maintain composure, Anselm asked what they did next. One of the elders, eyes downcast, recounted the grim ritual: a sharpened wooden stake driven through the corpse's chest, and a pyre set alight. The villagers had taken matters into their own hands, performing what the church would deem a profane act upon a human body. Mr. Frumbald's official report, which Anselm carried in his satchel, carefully absolved the authorities of blame for this grisly deed. With a lovely bureaucratic flourish, the provisor had even implored that if any mistake had been made, it be attributed not to him, but to the rabble, who were beside themselves with fear. Late that night, Father Anselm lit a candle in the small wooden chapel and read the full text of Frumbald's report by its wavering light. Each line tested the limits of his belief. The letter described how Plogojowitz's exhumed corpse showed new skin and nails, and how not the slightest odor of death could be detected. Anselm's heart pounded as he reached the report's horrifying climax. Not without astonishment, I saw some fresh blood in his mouth. In short, all the indications were present that such people, as remarked above, are said to have. After the people and I had seen this spectacle, all the subjects sharpened a stake and put this at his heart. Whereupon, as he was pierced, not only did much blood, completely fresh, flow, but still other wild signs, which I passed by out of high respect, took place. Father Anselm set down the manuscript, hands shaking. The dry bureaucratic language could not mask the horror of what it described. Fresh blood gushed from a staked corpse, a groan from the dead man's throat. As the stake went in, he whispered a prayer for Plogojowitz's soul, wondering in that moment whether he was praying in vain. The rational part of his mind recoiled. These must be exaggerations or mistakes. And yet, the testimony bore the seal of imperial officials and a parish priest. Alone in the silent chapel, Anselm realized that his journey had only begun. The old certainties of the Enlightenment felt less solid tonight. If this report was true, how could it be reconciled with his theology, with natural law? Steeling himself, the theologian resolved to seek out more evidence. He would travel next to the site of another notorious case rumored to have occurred nearby. Armed with his faith and reason, Father Anselm stepped out into the moonlit churchyard, determined and afraid of what he might find as the mystery deepened. Could faith alone steel a man's nerves when confronted with the horrors of the grave? Father Anselm repeated this prayer in his mind as he arrived in the village of Medveda. Imperial officers had summoned him to observe another vampire panic here. Not long ago, a former soldier named Arnold Paole had died in this village under unusual circumstances. Villagers whispered that his restless spirit was now attacking the living. Anselm met the investigation's leader at the edge of a churned-up graveyard at dawn. The officer recounted Arnold's strange story. The man had once been troubled by a vampire. Wherefore he had eaten from the earth of the vampire's grave and had smeared himself with the vampire's blood in a desperate attempt to break the curse. Yet, despite these precautions, Arnold Paole himself had supposedly risen from death to prey on his neighbors. Over the past few months, at least a dozen villagers of all ages had perished after brief, inexplicable illnesses, each with nightmares of being attacked by Arnold. Under imperial decree, a full inquiry was launched. Father Anselm steeled himself as he joined the party of soldiers and surgeons in exhuming the suspected victims and the body of Arnold Paole. One by one, coffins were pried open. Many contained ordinary decayed corpses, but to Anselm's astonishment, several were remarkably well preserved. One elderly woman, said to have been gaunt in life, lay plump and rosy in death. When the army surgeon pierced her skin, crimson blood spurted from the cut. Around the grave, onlookers gasped in unison. Anselm felt a wave of nausea and awe wash over him. How could a corpse interred weeks ago bleed as if alive? He whispered a psalm under his breath, clutching his crucifix as they proceeded to the next grave. Finally, they reached Arnold Paole's own resting place. As the lid was lifted, Anselm's heart pounded. There lay Arnold's corpse, intact and eerily lifelike in appearance, despite having been buried 40 days prior. The stench of disturbed death filled the air, yet Arnold's flesh looked flush with unnerving vitality. The investigators hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. Then, according to both local custom and grim necessity, they acted. With a swift motion and a dull thud, a sharpened stake was driven through the heart of Arnold's corpse. In that instant, a low groan escaped the dead man's lips, and a great gout of blood welled from the wound. Cries of terror erupted from the gathered villagers. Father Anselm nearly dropped his lantern in shock. Though he had braced for something unnatural, witnessing this grotesque semblance of life in a corpse left him trembling. The remains of Arnold Paole were swiftly burned to ash, and those ashes reinterred in hallowed ground, as the ritual remedy demanded. By nightfall, an official report was drafted to document the findings in Medveda. It soberly catalogued each chilling detail that Father Anselm had witnessed with his own eyes. How would such a report be received in the salons of the Enlightenment or the halls of the Church? Riding westward the next morning, Anselm felt the weight of what he carried, both the written testimonies and the burden of knowledge. The evidence of the undead was no longer confined to peasant rumors. It was signed and sealed by military officers and doctors. The unthinkable had become undeniable. As the sun rose, Father Anselm realized that the real struggle was only beginning. How would the learned world, grounded in reason and faith, contend with proof that the dead walked and fed on the living? Music. What happens when reasonable men are confronted with the unreasonable? Father Anselm faced this very question upon returning to the Baroque halls of his abbey. Summoned before an assembly of church scholars and local officials, he laid out the gruesome evidence gathered from the vampire-plagued villages. By candlelight in a vaulted chamber, he recounted the uncanny details, the undecomposed corpses, the ruddy blood, the terrifying groan of Arnold Paole's staked body. His audience, abbots, physicians, a magistrate, and a visiting Protestant minister, listened with faces ranging from pale shock to open skepticism. When Anselm finished, a heavy silence fell. At last, the senior abbot cleared his throat. "My son," he began gently, "these tales you tell greatly disturb our minds, but can we accept them as literal truth? Holy Church teaches that the dead do not rise again until the last day." He gestured to a worn Bible on the table. "Scripture promises a resurrection to life or judgment, not this perverse return you describe." A murmur of agreement passed through the gathered clerics. Anselm expected this objection. "Reverend Father," he replied, "I too was reluctant to believe it. Yet I saw it with my own eyes. These were not mere ghostly apparitions or rumors. We exhumed bodies that, by all natural law, should have been rotted, but were found fresh, even engorged with blood. Credible witnesses, including imperial officers and surgeons, testified and signed sworn documents. How can we dismiss this?" A rationalist physician in a powdered wig leaned forward. "Surely some natural explanation must exist," he insisted, offering that perhaps cold weather or peasant panic accounted for the reports. Perhaps the soil preserved these bodies from decay, or what villagers saw as blood was simply dark fluids of death. In short, frightened minds misinterpreted the ordinary. The doctor gave a thin smile, clearly unconvinced of anything supernatural. A few nods came from the secular scholars present. Anselm responded carefully, "Doctor, certainly many cases can be explained by such means, but not all. These reports include examinations by learned army surgeons." One surgeon, he opened to a marked page and read, "In this age, a new scene presents itself. They see men who have been dead for months come back, walk, and suck the blood of the living, so that people can only save themselves by exhuming and impaling them. These revenants are called vampires. One can hardly refuse to credit the belief held in those countries." Brother Augustine looked up. Even the erudite Dom Calmet of France admitted the abundance of testimony for these so-called vampires, though he later struggled with what to conclude. At the name Calmet, the abbot nodded, the assembly recognized it. Dom Calmet's treatise on apparitions and vampires had caused a stir in theological circles. "Yes," sighed the abbot. "I have read Calmet's work. He collected many such accounts, perhaps too many for comfort. But note," he added, raising a finger, "Calmet himself ultimately leaned toward disbelief. In the end, he found no theologically sound reason to affirm that the dead truly walk among us. Indeed, he reached the conclusion that vampires did not exist and that the vampire epidemic could be explained in terms of a combination of fearful delusions and the misinterpretation of the natural processes of death and decomposition." Brother Augustine closed the book and countered, "Calmet did not flatly reject the possibility, mind you. He simply found it theologically troublesome and looked for alternatives. But earlier in his treatise, he openly wrestled with the dilemma, the evidence versus doctrine." Augustine fixed the group with a serious gaze. "Theologically troublesome indeed. For if vampires are truly risen corpses, what does that imply? An unsanctioned resurrection? A work of the devil animating dead bodies? Either prospect is dreadful." The magistrate, who had been listening in uneasy silence, could hold his tongue no longer. "Even your own revered scholar finds a polite way to say it's all humbug," he scoffed. A few of the laymen chuckled nervously. Anselm felt a pang of frustration. He realized that no amount of testimony might sway some of these men. Brother Augustine spread his hands calmly. "Gentlemen, whether we believe or not, the fact remains something happened in those villages. Dismissing it outright would be folly. If not true revenants, perhaps it was a plague that mimicked the lore. Perhaps a demon masquerading as the undead. We must investigate with open minds." The senior abbot slowly nodded. The flicker of the candles etched heavy shadows on his lined face. "We shall continue this inquiry under the guidance of Holy Mother Church," he pronounced. "Father Anselm, you will compile your full report and send copies to Rome and to our metropolitan bishop. For now, let us speak of this matter with caution. The line between legitimate investigation and superstition is thin, and we tread perilously close to it. With that, the convocation ended. One by one, the scholars and clerics filed out, many still shaking their heads in denial or furrowing their brows in thought. Brother Augustine lingered, placing a reassuring hand on Anselm's shoulder. "Take heart, my friend," he said softly. "Truth will out in time. In the meanwhile, here." He pressed a few folios of parchment into Anselm's hands. "These are copies of ancient chronicles I promised you. You will find that our age is not the first to grapple with this horror." Anselm accepted the folios and managed a grateful nod. Soon he was alone in the chamber, the echoes of debate still ringing in his ears. The midnight oil had burnt low. He glanced down at Brother Augustine's parting gift. By lantern light, he read a chilling Latin passage from a 12th-century historian. It would not be easy to believe that the corpses of the dead should sally from their graves did not frequent examples occurring in our own times suffice to establish this as a warning to posterity, to the truth of which there is abundant testimony. Even in medieval times, learned men had encountered the same unholy phenomenon and recorded it as truth. Father Anselm crossed himself and gazed up at the dark vault of the ceiling. The scholarly debate had resolved little. Skepticism and fear still hung in the air. But one thing was clear to him: the puzzle of the vampires straddled the realms of the spiritual and the empirical, and it would not be solved easily. If answers could not be found in the present, he would seek guidance from the past. With a determined glint in his eye, Anselm gathered up Brother Augustine's manuscripts and resolved to delve further into the old chronicles and even forbidden tomes that might shed light on the mystery of the living dead. Father Anselm worked by a lone flickering lamp in the abbey's restricted library, surrounded by stacks of molding manuscripts. Here, in the hush of midnight, he sought truth in texts that many of his brethren would deem dangerous. The air smelled of dust and old ink. Hours earlier, with Brother Augustine's medieval excerpt as a guide, Anselm had petitioned the abbey's librarian for access to archives seldom opened. Reluctantly, he was granted a key to a heavy oak chest of problematic materials, documents on witchcraft, heresies, and supernatural occurrences that the Church kept under lock and key. By that key's power, Anselm now trespassed among centuries. He unrolled a crackling parchment letter dated 1347 from a Bavarian monastery, wherein a prior described a restless corpse that terrorized a village until the local bishop had the body exhumed and burned. The language was different, but the pattern was the same. In another record, a Greek chronicle from the 17th century, he read of how the islanders of Mykonos dealt with Avrikolakas, a ravenous undead being, by decapitating and incinerating it. That account matched the grisly remedies he himself had witnessed. As the night deepened, Anselm's candle stub grew short. He rubbed his eyes and opened a leather-bound codex that Brother Augustine had specifically recommended. It was a Latin translation of an old Orthodox treatise on incorrupt corpses and exorcisms. In its margins, a quill-wielding monk from ages past had scribbled furious notes. Anselm read a passage that made his blood run cold. In the Eastern Church, it was believed that certain excommunicated souls could not find rest, and their bodies would not decay until the Church's ban was lifted. One marginal note summarized: the Greeks say that excommunicated bodies do not rot, becoming vrikolakas that wander and suck blood, whereas we Latins hold that bodies which do not corrupt are marked with eternal beatitude. Here was a blasphemous inversion, an idea that incorruptibility might be a sign not of sainthood, but of eternal unrest. Anselm sat back, marveling at how even holiness and damnation could be seen as mirror images in different traditions. What one church celebrated, the other feared, and in those fearsome Eastern stories were seeds of the vampire lore now sprouting in the West. He realized that while the intellectuals in his circle debated theology, common folk across Europe and beyond had developed their own grim strategies to combat such creatures. Many of those strategies, staking, burning, prayer, he had already encountered. Were these practices born of superstition, he pondered, or of a hard-earned wisdom? He leafed through another text, an occult compendium seized during the witch trials of the previous century. Among chapters on demons and omens, it contained a section on revenants. Much was fanciful, but one Latin incantation caught his eye, purportedly to lay a vampire to rest. Anselm's lips tightened. Such sorcery lay outside his calling. He would not resort to it. Yet the existence of that forbidden spell only underscored how real the vampire was to those who compiled this grimoire. They gave the creature a name like a corpse devourer and warned that it thrived on the faithless and the weak. That phrase pricked Anselm's conscience. Was his own faith now weak? Dried blood matted his shirt. His eyes burned with a hollow hunger that was not human. Anselm's throat went dry. He forced himself to stand his ground. "Stephen," he addressed the figure gently, "I am here to help you. God is merciful. Be still and let me pray for your soul." In answer, the thing that was Stephen loosed a hiss like a feral cat. In a blur, it rushed forward with inhuman speed. The priest staggered back against the altar's base as the vampire halted just beyond the line of holy water he had sprinkled around him. It snarled, seemingly repelled by the blessed boundary, but paced just outside it like a wolf testing a fence. Anselm fumbled for his Bible and began to intone the Latin exorcism, Adjuro te, spiritus nequissimus. "I adjure thee, foul spirit, leave this servant of God." The creature clapped pallid hands over its ears and bared its fangs in pain or fury. It circled faster, making the priest turn to keep it in sight. With each sentence of the rite, Anselm felt his courage swell, but so did the vampire's wrath. It thrashed, and an unearthly voice issued from its throat, a sound that resonated with ancient malice. Anselm could not be sure if it truly spoke or merely invaded his mind. "Priest, your faith is weak. You cannot save him or yourself." Anselm's heart pounded. Doubt, like a serpent, coiled around his soul. Was he indeed weak? He raised his voice louder, shouting verses of scripture into the emptiness. The vampire recoiled momentarily, but then it began to laugh, a horrific, choking laugh, and stepped forward again. One foot crossed the line of holy water with evident effort. Anselm felt his confidence crumbling. He snatched up the wooden stake, his knuckles white around its shaft. All his scholarly arguments and historical knowledge felt meaningless in the face of this abomination. This was pure, wordless evil, mocking his rituals. Another step from the vampire. Now it was fully within the sacred space, inching closer, eyes fixed on the priest's throat. In that dire moment, Anselm's mind flashed to the arcane incantation he had memorized from the forbidden grimoire. A line of strange Latin, not a prayer, but a command said to bind a vampire, hovered on his tongue. Could this be the answer? The Church forbade such charms. Yet the Church's approved rites seemed to be failing. Another step from the vampire, closer now. Anselm backed against the altar, his free hand finding the silver crucifix there. The creature lunged. Desperate, the priest cried out the first foreign words of that taboo incantation. At the strange syllables, the vampire halted mid-spring, as if struck by an invisible chain. Its red eyes widened in surprise and fury. Sensing the illicit power in those words, the beast struggled but could not advance. Father Anselm stood shaking, stake raised, lips parted to continue the spell that had ensnared the fiend. One phrase more might compel it to lie down in its grave. And yet he hesitated. These words were not a prayer to God, but a manipulation of dark forces. To use them was to claim dominion by arcane means, a path that could cost his very soul. In that heartbeat of hesitation, the vampire howled and strained against its unseen bonds. The sound was a hellish shriek that jarred Anselm from his trance. "No," he gasped, his heart torn. He dropped the stake and instead seized the crucifix with both hands. Summoning every ounce of faith, he began to sing, a trembling but fervent chant of the Ave Maria. The Latin hymn to the Virgin echoed through the shattered chapel. The vampire hissed at the pure notes, its contorted face revealing agony. Smoke rose from its flesh as Anselm thrust the crucifix forward. "Sancta Maria, ora pro nobis." "Holy Mary, pray for us," he sang, tears in his eyes. The creature recoiled as if struck. The occult chains of the sorceress incantation fell away, replaced by the simple, searing light of prayer. Stephen's corpse writhed, caught between opposing powers. Anselm advanced now, voice rising, driving the monster back toward the open grave. The vampire, assailed by sacred song, gave a final shriek and fled with unnatural speed, not into the earth, but out through the gap in the wall, into the lightless forest beyond. For a long moment, Father Anselm stood alone in the ruined chapel, his song fading into a sob. The thing was gone for now, whether banished or merely repelled, he could not say. He fell to his knees, shaking violently, and clutched the blood-stained crucifix to his chest. In the silence, the priest was overcome by a wave of emotion, relief, triumph, but also a deep shame at how close he had come to damnation. In his desperation, he had nearly bartered away his soul for victory. Only by embracing the light at the final instant had he avoided that fate. Dawn was breaking when Anselm finally emerged from the chapel, exhausted, with streaks of gray in his hair that had not been there the night before. The eastern sky was stained rose and gold. As he stepped over the threshold, he realized the full import of what he had learned in the abyss of that night. The enemy he faced was not simply a dead man, nor something that could be solved by scholarly debate. It was a reflection of humanity's oldest fears and sins, a corruption of body and soul that forces one to confront the very foundations of faith, love, and damnation. Father Anselm knew this truth would not die with Stephen's retreat. The vampire would likely return, if not here, then elsewhere, to plague the world anew. But he also knew he would be ready, and so would those who came after him. With renewed purpose, he made his way back toward the village crossroad, the morning sun warm on his face, as if God himself were gently guiding him out of the darkness. "But first on earth as vampire sent, thy corpse shall from its tomb be rent. Then ghastly haunt thy native place, and suck the blood of all thy race. There from thy daughter, sister, wife, at midnight drain the stream of life. Yet loathe the banquet which perforce must feed thy livid living corpse." Music. The vampire of today bears little resemblance to the foul revenants Father Anselm battled in the 18th century. What was once a reeking peasant corpse has been reborn in our culture as an elegant, even seductive figure of the night. The metamorphosis is astonishing, yet it is not without logic. For each era, Anselm realized, reshapes the vampire to match its deepest anxieties and desires. In the months following his vigil in the ruined chapel, Father Anselm devoted himself to chronicling every detail of his investigation. His report, delivered not only to ecclesiastical authorities but also to a small circle of trusted scholars, was met with silence, concern, and in some quarters, disdain. The Church quietly filed it away, afraid of how such testimony might stir panic or contradict doctrine. And yet Anselm knew what he had witnessed. He bore not only physical scars from that long night but a soul forever marked by the truth. And that truth was not merely the existence of the vampire, but its meaning. In the solitude of his cloistered study, Anselm began to reflect more deeply. The vampire was not simply an undead predator. It was a philosophical wound. It undermined the idea of natural death, challenged the integrity of sacred burial, mocked the incorruption of saints. Worse still, it mirrored human fears in grotesque form: fear of death, fear of judgment, fear of being forgotten, or worse, becoming something monstrous beyond the grave. In time, Anselm discovered that his case was not unique. Across Europe, scattered reports trickled in, each different in detail, yet resonant in structure: a corpse that does not decay, a series of mysterious deaths, a ritual remedy rooted not in faith, but in folklore. Time and again, the same cycle repeated. And as these stories faded from official memory, they were picked up by another kind of chronicler, the writer. In the decades that followed, as the Enlightenment waned and Romanticism took hold, the vampire crept back into the world, not as a cadaver in a village, but as a character in literature. Anselm lived just long enough to see it happen. At first, these tales bore the stamp of old legends: the grotesque peasant monster, the predator of the grave. But soon they changed. A new image emerged: the nobleman vampire, aristocratic, intelligent, cursed, a being as much spiritual metaphor as physical threat. This vampire no longer clawed its way out of a Balkan grave. It arrived with a silver cane and a melancholy smile. Anselm read one such manuscript near the end of his life and was struck by how recognizable the themes were, even as the trappings evolved. Yet beneath the surface, the same current ran: hunger, death, the perversion of resurrection. The vampire remained a theological abomination, but now cloaked in elegance. Anselm feared this form even more, for it no longer repulsed. It tempted. He wrote in his final journal, "The vampire changes shape, not nature. It was once mud-caked and feral. Now it is perfumed and cultured, but its purpose remains: the subversion of death and the consumption of the living. We laugh at the grave no longer. We invite it to dinner." It is this revelation that cemented his legacy, not only as a chronicler of undead horrors, but as a prophet of myth. For Anselm grasped what modern thinkers would only later articulate: that the vampire endures because it is not just a creature, but an idea that survives exorcisms, outlasts empires, adapts to every age. And as the centuries marched on, the idea would flourish in novels, plays, films, in whispers, in symbols. Some would turn the vampire into a tragic figure, others into a metaphor for addiction, seduction, even capitalism. But the essential truth would remain, hidden beneath each retelling: that the vampire is the dark echo of humanity's desire to live forever, without cost, without virtue, without grace. Father Anselm died in peace, but not in certainty. His final confession, discovered decades later among his private papers, ends with a question not unlike the one that began his journey: if the vampire is not simply a monster, but a mirror, then what does it say of us that we keep staring into it and smiling?